Before we get started, a quick heads up. Presidents Unplugged now has merch. If you want to support the show and represent the podcast in your daily life, you can at presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. That is presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. Now, let's get into today's episode. In the year 1944, two very important things happened. First, my grandma was born. Love you, Graham. But second off, a tragedy happened. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in the heat of World War II, a young man named George H.W. Bush floated alone on a small life raft. Exhausted, severely injured, and uncertain after his plane was shot down during a dangerous World War II mission. All the other people with him were lost and murdered by the Japanese. Survival for Bush was nearly impossible, and yet he lived. He was rescued by a submarine called the USS Finback and given a chance at life. But why? Why out of all these men was George H.W. Bush the one to survive? He had a purpose. Little did he know that that purpose was the presidency of the United States. Let's do this. To understand George H.W. Bush, we need to start way back from where he came from. George H.W. Bush actually had very distant ties back to English royalty. But, unlike that one girl in elementary school who said, "My daddy drives a Mercedes. My grandpa used to own the company. Nobody cares, Felicia." Even though Bush probably could have somehow used these ties to get him somewhere, his life was defined more by his dedication than by his family history. This dedication was not only shown in his work ethic, but when he found the love of his life, Barbara Bush. Born Barbara Pierce. Hold on, presidential historians, let's think about this for a second. That name sounds familiar. Wow, this episode already has a lot of family ties. Barbara Pierce, who would eventually become Barbara Bush, actually was a descendant of Franklin Pierce, the 14th United States president. But when they got together, they formed one of the strongest marriages in presidential history. And I'd like to add about Bush's childhood something that's pretty important. Bush could have easily used his status to get him out of things and to kind of give him a reserved, rich life. But he didn't do that at all. He chose service, joining the Navy at 18 years old and becoming one of the youngest pilots in World War II, flying difficult combat missions that really shaped him as a person, giving him the humility and the valor that he would carry for the rest of his life. But here's the story from the beginning, told once more. Bush, after a semi-failed operation, was pretty doomed. His entire crew was taken by the Japanese and murdered, and let's just say some people rumored cannibalism. This is not a good way to go. Bush was the only one left. He returned home to attend Yale University, where he studied economics, graduated quickly, moved to Texas, and found success in something that you might have heard before, in the oil industry. But then he felt called into public service when he won a seat in the House of Representatives. This began a steady political rise that brought him into major national roles under President Gerald Ford. Under Gerald Ford, he became the ambassador to the United Nations and director of the Central Intelligence Agency, better known as the CIA. This earned him respect on both sides of politics, and it proved something. Bush understood foreign affairs at a really deep level. But as we know from Richard Nixon's infamous Watergate scandal, Gerald Ford only finished out his term. He didn't have one of his own. Ford was not president for very long. But even though he hadn't been president for too long, meaning that Bush hadn't been in a position for very long, Bush was ready. He was ready to run for president. So it's 1980. George H.W. Bush is up to the podium as one of the major Republican candidates, feeling pretty confident, yeah, I got this in the bag. And then he sees that famous Californian governor named Ronald Wilson Reagan. Surprisingly, this was still a pretty big fight between the two of who would become president. They constantly jabbed at each other, talking about different debacles in the Republican Party, especially in economics, what George H.W. Bush studied. He looked at Ronald Reagan's plan for the economy and called it voodoo economics. That's not a compliment. But then we had an awkward moment. Then George H.W. Bush became Ronald Reagan's vice president candidate after Bush couldn't win the presidency himself. Sure, Reagan, I'll run with you. I'm sorry I made fun of your economic plan. Okay, whatever. It's okay, George H.W. Bush. Now you and Ronald Reagan are on the ticket together to be the president and the vice president of the United States. Even though he clowned him a little bit in the beginning, George H.W. Bush was a pretty good vice president for all 8 years, with a lot of loyalty and respect for the man in charge at the time, Ronald Reagan. But then, Reagan was done with his 8 years, and somebody needed to step up. Somebody needed to fill the shoes of one of the most defining 20th century presidents. So who was going to do it? None other than George H.W. Bush. While George Washington himself might not have had an Instagram page, Presidents Unplugged does. If you want to see some presidential content and overall updates on the show, come to the Instagram at Presidents_Unplugged. See you there. In 1988, when George H.W. Bush ran for president, he made a promise to the American people. Read my lips. No new taxes. Those words would come to bite him in the butt. Even though he won this election against Michael Dukakis, who, funny enough, at the time, was getting political slander for a picture surfacing of him just chilling in a tank. Yeah, before the internet. I know, wild. But I believe that George H.W. Bush won this election in majority because he was kind of like the second Ronald Reagan, the one to carry the torch. Kind of like Lyndon Johnson that we talked about last week. If I could just fill the legacy of the guy behind me that was doing pretty good, it'll work out. But this statement of read my lips, no new taxes, came up when Americans got new taxes. The economy was struggling, and it was hurting the trust of the American people. H.W. Bush had just completely lied about his plan for the American people's economy, and that didn't sit so well with people. But even though the economy struggled, and really, the economy is always the main focus of presidencies, at least modern presidencies. But he did have some success in his presidency. Remember how he was so good at foreign affairs when he was director of the CIA? He was a very steady and confident person when it came to war. It's almost like he had fought in one. But Bush set up a global coalition against Saddam Hussein after the invasion of Kuwait. A coalition is a bunch of political figures getting together for a united cause at a time of trouble. What does Kuwait have? I don't know, Kuwaitis, which are people who live in Kuwait? No. Kuwait had oil. And Saddam Hussein was wanting to guzzle up some oil from this country. And Kuwait was pretty vulnerable. They were pretty small in comparison to the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, and this is when America stepped in to defend the Kuwaitis. This war was very successful in America. It's regarded as an extreme success. And I would agree. We got the war pretty much over with in less than half a year. We had very little American loss. And we won. We beat Saddam Hussein. But this wasn't enough. No matter how much we cheered and screamed and hurrahed that the American people had won this war, it wasn't enough. This was right around the end of his presidential term. It was only 4 years, so this is why this presidency piece of the Presidents Unplugged episode is not the longest. Even though he had this major success in the Gulf War, it wasn't enough popularity-wise for the American people. And it didn't help that they were about to deal with the 1992 election. Here comes the final part of this episode. What had H.W. Bush done during his presidency? He had screwed up the economy. He had won the Gulf War. Okay, that's pretty good. He'd signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. Good job, Bush. But there was another guy. Another guy named Ross Perot, a member of the newly formed Reform Party. The two most notable members who ran for president under the Reform Party were Ross Perot in 1992 and Donald Trump in the year 2000. Ross Perot is fascinating to me. He didn't need campaign funding. In politics, if you don't lean to the left or to the right and you're kind of stuck in the middle, you're not going to get funded by too many people unless they directly support you. The Republican Party and the Democrat Party, they have a lot of money. Middle grounds don't really have too much. But Ross Perot didn't need them. He was a billionaire. And he made sure you knew it. Ross Perot would actually get large chunks of TV time through commercials to show off his economic plans for the United States. But here's the issue. Ross Perot's economic ideas kind of leaned towards the right, which made Republicans ask the question, are we going to vote for the incumbent Republican who's just been president? He's done an okay job in certain stuff, but not other stuff. Or this new guy? Bush messed up the economy, maybe he can change it. So this began division in the Republican Party. To my long-standing members of Presidents Unplugged, this reminds us a lot of the election of 1912. The election of 1912 was controversial because the Republican Party split up. Because when there's a major third party, in American history especially, most of the time they lean towards the right, which splits up the Republican Party. So, okay, Bush and Perot are split with the Republicans, so who's the third guy? Bill Clinton. this new governor of Arkansas with a deep Southern charm and the ability to persuade, the charisma to change, the charisma, I will make America great. Yeah. These three candidates, if I'm being honest, are not my favorites. But here's the deal. After this election result came back, we saw a scarily reminiscent picture of 1912. The Republican major candidate, the incumbent, which in our example is H.W. Bush, it was William Taft in 1912, won about 35% of the vote. The third-party candidate, who leaned towards the Republican way, won about 12 to 13% of the vote. While Bill Clinton, winning just over 40% of the vote, didn't at all have the majority. He just had the most, which allowed Bill Clinton to become our president. Wait, that's it? That's George H.W. Bush's entire legacy? Yeah, pretty much. Other than the fact that his son became the governor of Texas and then became the president in 2001, H.W. Bush's major American legacy ends there. And I'm just going to tell you, to an outsider, that sounds really disappointing. We want to know the big wars, the big decisions, the big fights that happened while they were president. But I think George H.W. Bush's story is bigger than that. It's about a soldier who faced death right in front of him and crazy survival as a teenager. He was a public servant who worked with people he disagreed with just to get stuff done. And a steady patriot who showed that wealth does not stop you from sacrificing and quiet service for your country. H.W. Bush didn't have a flashy presidency. He really didn't have any major flashy jobs. He wasn't the main character, as people say. But I still give him props. Even though he's not remembered as one of the greatest, his courage, humility, and commitment to the American people and the country as a whole should be. And in many ways, that is what makes George H.W. Bush so important. Tune in next Friday as we talk about Ronald Reagan, a passionate kid who grew up to be an actor. And that's all he did. Oh, no, he didn't. After being an actor for a while, Ronald Reagan decided to shift his life completely to become a politician. How can a little kid with a dream become the President of the United States? And why is Ronald Reagan regarded as one of the most important presidents of the 20th century? Learn about that and much more next week on Presidents Unplugged. I'm Ty Svensson, and I'll see you soon. God bless. Thank you for listening to Presidents Unplugged. If you enjoy content like this, give us a follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, when do we release new content? Once a month, maybe twice a year, maybe even once a year? No. We release new content every Friday at 1 p.m. for my American enthusiasts to enjoy. Come join me on our dive into making American history the most entertaining and interesting subject to learn every single week. I'm Ty Svensson, this is Presidents Unplugged, and I'll see you soon.